The heavy silk of the wedding dress felt less like a garment and more like a suffocation, a white satin cage tailored to fit every curve of Maya's trembling body. Standing before the oversized, frosted mirrors of the church's preparation room, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her dark skin, usually vibrant and warm, looked ashen under the harsh fluorescent lights, contrasting sharply with the pristine, blinding white of the gown. This was not a celebration. It was a transaction. Her father, a man whose gambling debts had finally eclipsed his love for his only daughter, had not even looked her in the eye when he told her she was to be the payment. The door creaked open, and the sound hit her like a gunshot, making her jump in her heels. It was time. The hallway leading to the sanctuary smelled of beeswax and old fear, a scent that seemed to cling to the velvet walls. As she walked, the train of her dress hissed against the floorboards, a sound like a snake following her toward her doom. She knew the reputation of the man waiting at the altar.
Daehyun Kimo.
The name alone was enough to silence a room in the underground clubs where her father lost their fortune. They called him a monster, a broken king, a man who ruled the city's shadow economy from a wheelchair because his legs had been crushed in a war no one spoke about aloud. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a ribcage of bone and lace. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing the cavernous nave of the cathedral, but it was empty of friends or extended family. Instead, the pews were filled with men in dark suits, their expressions unreadable, their postures rigid with concealed weaponry. At the far end of the long, red-carpeted aisle, a solitary figure sat motionless. He was turned away from the altar, facing her. Even from this distance, the aura of power radiating from him was palpable, a cold gravity that seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. She took the first step, and the silence of the church amplified the click of her heels, marking the seconds of freedom she had left. The walk down the aisle felt interminable, a slow-motion descent into a nightmare that had been orchestrated with terrifying precision. Maya kept her chin high, a final act of defiance against a fate she had no power to stop. As she drew closer, the details of her future husband came into sharp focus, shattering the vague, monstrous image she had constructed in her mind. Daehyun was older, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from cold marble. His hair was jet black, swept back with severe discipline, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the jawline that was set in a permanent state of tension. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, dark, abyssal, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once dreamed of finding at an altar. He sat in a sleek, titanium wheelchair that looked more like a throne than a medical device, his hands resting calmly on his lap. Those hands were scarred, the knuckles rough, a stark contrast to the immaculate cut of his bespoke tuxedo. When she finally reached the altar, the air between them crackled with an electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She expected him to look at her with hunger or possessiveness, the way men often looked at things they had bought. Instead, his gaze was clinical, assessing her as one might assess a structural vulnerability in a building. The priest, a nervous man who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, began the ceremony with a trembling voice. Maya could feel the weight of the men in the pews behind her, hundreds of eyes boring into her back, but her world had narrowed to the man in the chair. When it came time to exchange rings, the power dynamic shifted physically in a way that jarred her. She had to bend down to him. It was a moment of forced intimacy, her white dress pooling around her as she lowered herself to his level. He reached out and, for the first time, skin touched skin. His hand was shockingly cold, but his grip was steady, controlled, and gentle in a way that terrified her more than violence would have. He slid the heavy diamond onto her finger, his eyes never leaving hers, and in that silent exchange, she realized that he wasn't just marrying her. He was acquiring her soul. The transition from the sacred silence of the church to the armored reality of his life was abrupt and jarring. There was no reception, no cake, no first dance. As soon as the priest muttered the final blessing, Daehyun signaled to his men with a subtle twitch of his finger, and the machinery of his organization sprang into motion. They were ushered out a side door into the relentless gray drizzle of the city, where a convoy of black SUVs waited like a hearse procession. Maya stood by the open door of the lead vehicle, unsure of protocol. She watched as two of his hulking bodyguards moved to lift Dae-hyun from his chair into the car, but he stopped them with a sharp, guttural command in Korean. With a grit of his teeth that made a vein pulse in his temple, he maneuvered himself, using incredible upper body strength to transfer his weight from the chair to the leather seat of the car. It was a display of raw, stubborn independence that hinted at the violence of his pride. Maya climbed in beside him, the heavy door thudding shut and sealing them in a vacuum of silence and leather. The tinted windows turned the city outside into a ghost town. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The car hummed smoothly over the asphalt, the rain streaking the glass like tears. She sat pressed against the door, trying to make herself as small as possible, terrified that any movement might provoke him. Dae-hyun stared straight ahead, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. The scent of him, expensive cologne, tobacco, and something metallic like rain on pavement, filled the enclosed space. "You are trembling," he said suddenly. His voice was deep, textured like gravel, and completely devoid of mockery. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Maya clenched her hands in her lap, her knuckles turning white. "I don't know what you expect of me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He turned his head slowly, the movement mechanical and deliberate. "I expect you to survive," he said, his eyes catching the light. "That is the only thing that matters in my house." Survival. The cryptic nature of the statement sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He wasn't talking about domestic duties. He was warning her. The convoy wound its way up the winding roads toward the cliffs overlooking the city, leaving the urban sprawl behind for the isolated opulence of the coastline. The estate that came into view was not the Gothic mansion she had imagined, but a sprawling, modernist fortress of glass, steel, and concrete that seemed to hang precariously over the ocean. It was beautiful, cold, and imposing, much like its owner. As the gates parted and the car pulled into the circular driveway, Maya saw the extent of the security. Cameras on every corner, armed guards patrolling the perimeter with military precision. This wasn't just a home, it was a stronghold. The driver opened the door, and the rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and salty. She stepped out, her dress heavy and damp at the hem, and watched as the guards assembled Dae-hyun's chair. Once he was settled, he moved with practiced speed toward the massive front doors, expecting her to follow. Inside, the house was a cavern of minimalism. The floors were polished concrete, the walls adorned with abstract art that looked like violent slashes of paint on canvas. It was devoid of warmth, devoid of life. He led her, or rather, she followed the hum of his electric motor, through the main hall toward a private elevator. The staff they passed bowed low, eyes averted, terrified to even look at their master. The silence in the house was heavier than it had been in the car. Inside the elevator, as the numbers climbed, the air grew thin. They stepped out into a penthouse level that spanned the entire top floor. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic expanse of the dark ocean crashing against the rocks below, but Maya couldn't focus on the scenery. She was trapped in the sky with a man she knew only by his bloody reputation. Dae-hyun wheeled himself to a sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid, his movements precise. "This is where we live," he said, turning to face her. "No guards come up here, unless I call them. There are no cameras on this floor." He took a sip of his drink, watching her. "You are wondering why you are here. Why I paid your father's debt," Maya nodded, her throat too dry to speak. He set the glass down with a sharp clink. "Because where you come from is a snake pit," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And I needed someone who knows how to walk among vipers without getting bitten." He gestured for her to follow him down a long corridor, the sound of his wheels on the floor the only noise in the vast apartment. They reached a set of double doors, and he pushed them open to reveal a master suite that was larger than the entire apartment she had grown up in. A massive bed dominated the center of the room, draped in gray linens. Panic flared in Maya's chest, hot and blinding. This was it, the moment she had been dreading since her father signed the papers. She backed up a step, her hands coming up instinctively to cover her chest. Dae-hyun stopped his chair in the center of the room and rotated to face her. He saw the fear in her eyes, the raw, animalistic terror of prey cornered by a predator. For a moment, his expression softened, the marble mask cracking just enough to reveal a tired, human exhaustion underneath. "Stop," he commanded, but the word was not shouted. It was spoken with a weary authority. He maneuvered the chair away from the bed, toward a separate door on the far side of the room. "You think I bought you for this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the bed with a look of disdain. "You are a child, and I am a cripple. The world thinks I am a monster, Maya, but I am not a savage." The use of her name, spoken with that strange, gravelly accent, stunned her into stillness. He pointed to the bed. "That is yours. You will sleep there. You will be safe there." He then pointed to the door he was near. "I sleep in the adjoining study. The door locks from your side." Maya stared at him, her mind struggling to process the reprieve. "I don't understand," she stammered. "Why marry me? Why bring me here?" If he cut her off with a sharp look. "Because your father was going to sell you to men who would not have given you a separate room," he said, the brutality of the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "You are my wife now. That title is a shield. No one touches you. Not the debt collectors. Not your father. And not me." He turned his chair around, his back to her, a barrier of black tuxedo and steel. "Go to sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." With that, he rolled into the darkness of the study, leaving her alone in the center of the room, surrounded by luxury, confusion, and a strange, dawning sense of safety. The first morning in the glass fortress broke not with sunlight, but with a gray, diffused luminescence that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting the room in the color of pearls. Maya woke with a start, her heart thumping against the high-thread count sheets, momentarily disoriented by the vastness of the bed and the unfamiliar silence. The events of the previous day, the church, the contract, the wheelchair, the gunmetal eyes of her husband, rushed back to her in a dizzying wave. She sat up, clutching the duvet to her chest, half expecting Dae-hyun to be watching her from the shadows, but the room was empty. The door to his study was closed. She rose, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, and found a wardrobe that had been stocked overnight. It was filled with clothes that fit her perfectly, silks in jewel tones, tailored trousers, cashmere sweaters. It was a wardrobe designed for a woman of power, not a trophy wife. She dressed in a simple, elegant navy dress that felt like armor and ventured out into the main living area. Dae-hyun was there, positioned by the window overlooking the churning sea, a tablet balanced on his lap and an earpiece in his ear. He was speaking low, rapid-fire Korean, his hand slicing the air with sharp, decisive gestures. When he sensed her presence, the conversation cut off instantly. He pulled the earpiece out and turned his chair, the motor humming softly. He looked tired, the shadows beneath his eyes darker than before, but his gaze swept over her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You slept," he stated, his voice raspy with morning disuse. On the table in front of him was a breakfast spread, fruits, pastries, and strong coffee.
"Sit. Eat."
"We have much to discuss." Maya sat opposite him, the marble table feeling like a continental divide. "You said last night that I had to work," she said, pouring coffee with a steady hand despite her nerves. "What work does a mafia boss have for a girl who has only ever known debt?" Dae-hyun leaned forward, resting his elbows on the arms of his chair, interlacing his scarred fingers. "My legs are broken, Maya, but my enemies think my mind is broken too. They think I am weak because I cannot stand to look them in the eye." His eyes locked onto hers, burning with a dark, suppressed fire. "I need you to be my proxy. You will enter the rooms I cannot. You will hear the whispers they hide from me. You have lived in fear your whole life. You know how to smell a lie." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers for a second before retreating, a gesture of almost touch that left the air vibrating. "I am not asking you to hold a gun. I am asking you to be the queen on the board while I move the pieces." The preparation for her first public appearance as Mrs. Kim was grueling, a crash course in the intricate, lethal politics of the city's underworld. For 3 days, they barely left the penthouse. Dae-hyun was a demanding teacher, his patience thin but his instructions precise. He taught her the names of the rival families, the specific weaknesses of the city's councilmen, and the subtle signals he would use to communicate with her. But in the quiet moments between lessons, the atmosphere shifted from instructional to intimate. He would watch her as she studied the dossiers, his gaze lingering on the curve of her neck or the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. On the fourth evening, they were to attend a charity gala, a neutral ground where predators mingled with high society. Maya emerged from the bedroom wearing a gown of emerald velvet that Dae-hyun had selected. It was modest in cut but devastating in fit, hugging her figure and leaving her shoulders bare. When she walked into the living room, Dae-hyun stopped his wheelchair mid-turn. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. He didn't say she looked beautiful. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he wheeled himself closer, stopping inches from her. He reached out, his cool fingers grazing her collarbone to adjust the thin gold chain she wore. The touch was electric, sending a shockwave straight to her core. "They will try to intimidate you," he murmured, his voice low and rough, staring at the pulse fluttering in her throat. "They will look at you and see a victim. Show them they are wrong." He looked up into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of possession that wasn't about ownership, but about pride. "You are not just wearing my name tonight, Maya. You are carrying my honor." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips, but instead of kissing the skin, he pressed his forehead against her knuckles for a brief, vulnerable second. It was a gesture of reverence that shook her more than any threat could have. "Stay close to me," he commanded softly, releasing her hand. "Do not let go of my chair unless I tell you." The gala was a sensory overload of crystal chandeliers, orchestral music, and the cloying scent of expensive perfume masking the smell of corruption. The moment they entered the ballroom, the conversation died. Hundreds of eyes turned to them. The crippled king and his young, stunning bride. Maya felt the weight of the stairs, but she remembered Dae-hyun's words. She placed a hand on his shoulder, standing beside his chair like a sentinel. She could feel the tension in his muscles under the tuxedo jacket. He was coiled, ready to strike if necessary. They moved through the crowd, Dae-hyun navigating the clusters of people with cold efficiency. Then a man approached, tall, broad, with a smile that didn't reach his shark-like eyes. It was Kong, a rival territory boss who had been encroaching on Dae-hyun's ports. "Dae-hyun," Kong boomed, ignoring Maya entirely. "I didn't think you'd make it. It's a lot of effort, isn't it? Getting around?" The insult was veiled but obvious. The men around them snickered quietly. Dae-hyun's expression remained stone, but Maya felt his shoulder muscle twitch beneath her hand. A protective fury, hot and sudden, flared in her chest. She stepped forward slightly, angling her body between Kong and her husband. "Mr. Kong," she said, her voice clear and melodic, cutting through the tension. "My husband preserves his energy for things that matter. Like the new shipping contracts he secured this morning." The room went silent. Kang's smile faltered. The contracts she mentioned were a secret victory Dae-hyun had only told her about an hour ago. Revealing it now, in front of everyone, was a power move that humiliated Kong by showing he was out of the loop. "It must be exhausting," she continued, tilting her head with a deceptive sweetness. "Chasing scraps while the king eats." She felt Dae-hyun's hand find her waist, his grip firm and grounding. He wasn't stopping her. He was anchoring her. He looked up at Kong, a dark smirk playing on his lips. "My wife has a sharp tongue," Dae-hyun said smoothly. "I suggest you don't cut yourself on it." As they moved away, leaving Kong fuming, Dae-hyun's hand slid from her waist to her hand, interlacing their fingers tightly. He didn't let go for the rest of the night. The ride home was silent, but it was a comfortable, charged silence. The rain had started again, drumming rhythmically against the roof of the SUV. Maya sat closer to him this time, their thighs brushing with the sway of the car. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a raw, trembling awareness of the man beside her. When they arrived back at the penthouse, the staff had already retired. The lights were dimmed to a low, amber glow. Dae-hyun wheeled himself into the living room and stopped, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. He began to loosen his tie, his movements stiffer than usual. Maya realized with a pang of guilt that the night had taken a physical toll on him, holding himself upright in the chair for hours, maintaining the facade of invulnerability, caused him pain he refused to show. Without thinking, she moved to him. "Let me," she whispered, her hands brushing his aside. He froze, his eyes widening slightly as she undid the knot of his tie and slid the silk from around his neck. She didn't stop there. She moved behind him, helping him shrug out of the tight tuxedo jacket. As the heavy fabric fell away, she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles were knotted from stress. She hesitated, then placed her hands on his traps, her thumbs digging into the hard muscle. Dae-hyun groaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest. He didn't pull away. He leaned back into her touch, his head falling back against her stomach. It was an intimacy far greater than sex. It was a surrender. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured, his eyes closed, his guard completely down. "No one has ever defended me like that." Maya moved her hands to his temples, massaging gently. "You don't need defending," she said softly. "But I wanted to." He reached up, capturing her hand and pulling it down to his lips. This time, he kissed her palm, his lips warm and lingering. "I have spent 10 years building walls to keep people out," he whispered against her skin. "I did not expect you to climb them so easily." Days turned into weeks, and the boundaries between duty and desire began to blur into non-existence. The penthouse ceased to be a cage and became a sanctuary where the rest of the world couldn't touch them. They developed a rhythm. Mornings spent strategizing over coffee, evenings spent reading or listening to jazz records that Dae-hyun collected. The romance that grew between them was quiet, woven into the fabric of survival. It was in the way he would wheel into the kitchen just to watch her cook, or the way she would drape a blanket over his legs when he fell asleep working late. But the peace was fragile. One evening, a storm was battering the coast, shaking the glass walls of the house. Dae-hyun was agitated, pacing, rolling, back and forth, checking his phone repeatedly. "What is it?" Maya asked, looking up from her book. Before he could answer, the security alarms blared, a piercing shriek that shattered the calm. The lights cut out, plunging the apartment into darkness. "Get down." She saw a figure flanking him from the shadows near the kitchen, raising a weapon while Dae-hyun was engaged with the others. Fear was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She grabbed a heavy marble bust from the pedestal beside her and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the gunman in the shoulder, throwing his aim off just as he fired. The bullet shattered a window instead of finding Dae-hyun's heart. Dae-hyun whipped around, saw the threat, and finished it with a single shot. Silence fell, heavy and smelling of cordite. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in red. Dae-hyun wheeled toward her, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and rage. He didn't check the bodies, he checked her. He grabbed her face with both hands, his gun clattering to the floor. "I told you to run," he rasped, his voice shaking. "Why didn't you run?" Maya gripped his wrists, her own hands trembling. "Because you were here," she said, the truth of it hitting them both at once. "I'm not leaving you, Dae-hyun. Not ever." The aftermath of the attack changed everything. The breach had been orchestrated by a traitor in his inner circle, a man Dae-hyun had trusted for years. The betrayal hardened him to the outside world, but it shattered the last of his defenses with Maya. That night, after the police had been paid off and the bodies removed, the house was quiet again, but the air was charged with a new, undeniable reality. They were in the master bedroom. Dae-hyun had refused to let her out of his sight. He sat by the edge of the bed, the gun back within reach, but his focus was entirely on her. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as a debt payment, not as a wife, but as the only thing in the world that mattered. "I thought I was saving you," he said quietly, the confession hanging in the air. "When I paid your father, I told myself I was just acquiring an asset. A clean slate." He wheeled closer, trapping her between his knees. But that was a lie. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to her. It was a picture of her, taken 3 years ago, walking out of a library in the rain. Maya stared at it, shocked. "You knew me," she whispered. "I saw you once," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "You were reading poetry in a park while your father was losing his life savings in my casino. You looked so defiant.
So alive.
I have been watching you ever since, ensuring no other debt collector touched you." He took the photo back and tossed it aside, reaching for her hands. "I didn't marry you to settle a debt, Maya. I created the debt so I could marry you, The revelation should have been terrifying, the depth of his obsession, the manipulation. But looking at him now, seeing the raw need in his eyes, she only felt seen. She stepped between his knees, closing the distance, and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart. "Then you made a good investment," she whispered, leaning down. Dae-hyun let out a ragged breath and pulled her down to him, his mouth crashing onto hers. It was a kiss of starvation, of years of watching and wanting, a claiming that went deeper than any ring. He wasn't just the monster in the chair anymore, he was her monster. And as she kissed him back, tasting the danger and the devotion on his lips, she knew that the girl in the white dress was gone. In her place was a queen who had found her king in the ruins of a broken world.